Beautiful. Okay, thank you. Richard, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. We miss Richard at our shul in these last years. Yes, lots of wires. I'm going to trip on them, kill myself. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I grew up in the Zionist movement. My mother was a longtime national, regional, local officer of Hadassah. And my grandfather was the president of Mizrahi, and my great-great-uncles were founders of the Labor Party, so I've got all different kinds of Zionist connections that I grew up with. What I want to share with you today is just some of the public opinion data from the United States about Israel. And we'll get into where we have some problems and where we don't have problems. In general, Americans hold positive views of Israel. I see William Daroff is here. He saw almost a pretty similar presentation, about 36 hours ago at the GA. But anyway, for the most part, Americans have held favorable views of Israel, as you can see. In general, the numbers have been pretty consistent over a fairly long period of time. About high 60s, low 70% of people have had a favorable impression of Israel as a country. Mid 20s have been unfavorable. Unfortunately, these slides are not transferring here very readily. Sorry, give me one more second to see what's happening here. Okay, well, somehow, if I could, unfortunately, I only have one word. Let's just see if this will work. I have this on USB drive, but I don't think I'm going to make one. I'll have two. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, let's see if we can make this work more effectively. Yes, we can. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. As I was saying, people have held a pretty favorable view of Israel over time. The Republicans are more likely to hold a favorable view of Israel than either Democrats or independents, but still it's the overwhelming majority of Democrats at 61%, the overwhelming majority of independents at 70% who hold favorable views of Israel, Republicans at about 81% favorable towards Israel. And as you can see, there's some other differences as you go through the different demographics, particularly a difference between those under 30 and those over 60, over 65, and obviously those in between, somewhere in the middle. Both President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu are quite unpopular with Americans. Only 14% have a favorable view of Abbas, 30% are unfavorable. Bibi is better known, but only 21% are favorable, 48% are unfavorable towards Bibi. That is a problem, and we'll talk more about that problem going forward. When you look at the governments, if you will, the favorability of Israel government is evenly divided in the country. And I should say this data comes from progressive activists. What we looked at before was the public as a whole. What we're looking at now, and I'll try and differentiate between these two, is progressive activists. So these are liberals who are active in political matters, issues of various kinds, labor, women's movement, other kinds of issues. And as you can see, they are less favorable towards Israel in general. They are also, as you can see, excuse me, very unfavorable toward the Palestinian Authority as an entity. But the other important thing to keep in mind here is there is no correlation. There is no correlation between attitudes toward the Palestinians and attitudes towards Israel, which is to say, we naturally think it's a zero-sum game, that if we can get people to dislike the Palestinians, they'll like us. Not true. We can get everyone to dislike the Palestinians, and they'll still dislike Israel. We get everyone to dislike Israel, and still dislike the Palestinians. These two are not related to each other. We may think they should be, but they're not. There are some very specific weaknesses, again, among progressive activists in Israel's image. So we asked people how well these terms describe Israel. Going towards Richard's side of the room, it's people saying, yes, that does describe Israel. Going towards my side of the room does not describe Israel. You see what the top of the list is. a net 65 points. That is, by 65-point margin, people say that Israel does face real threats from neighboring countries. People also say by a large margin that Israel respects the rights, civil rights and human rights of Jews. Those are the two strongest associations. They're both positive, but just below that we start to have some negative associations. Gets more from the U.S. than it gives in return. Building too many settlements on Palestinian land, too unwilling to negotiate a peace agreement, racially segregated. Again, these are less descriptive, but you see at the bottom of the list, while at the top of the list is respects the rights, civil rights and human rights of Jews, toward the bottom of the list respects the human and civil rights of Palestinians. Overwhelmingly, progressive activists say that is not true. They believe Israel does not respect the human and civil rights of Palestinians. You'll also see, if you look at some of these numbers a little bit more carefully in subgroups, there are a significant number in some segments who think that Israel is too religious a country. Overall, that is a view that people have. It's even more prevalent in other segments. Nonetheless, again, going back to the public as a whole, a majority of Americans sympathize with Israel. People have been asked for many years whether they sympathize more with Israel or more with the Palestinians. And as you can see, the numbers have really been fairly consistent over time, in the high 40s, lower 50s, saying they sympathize more with Israel, and in the high teens, low to high teens, saying that they sympathize more with the Palestinians. Now, there's been a change in partisan views of this issue, or of these sympathies, excuse me, over time. The story, though, is not what people typically think. What people typically think is Democrats have fallen off dramatically in their support for Israel. That's not really true, at least until the most recent year. But if you look back to 1978, for example, there was very little difference between where Democrats, Republicans, and independents were in terms of their sympathies. When you get to the sort of mid-2000s, all of a sudden you start to get a big separation. But that's not because Democrats are falling off, it's because Republicans are zooming up in terms of their sympathy for Israel, relatively speaking. Why is that? Well, first of all, you have the incorporation of the evangelical movement into the Republican Party, and the evangelical movement is strongly pro-Israel. Second, you have an increasing sense of sort of follow the leader in American politics, where people tend to follow where their party leaders are taking them, wherever that may be. Republican Party leaders are advocating strong pro-Israel positions. Republicans say to themselves, well, my leader is strongly pro-Israel, I must be too. I may not know anything about it, but that's what they're saying, so I must be pro-Israel too. Democrats, though, if you look, again, literally until 2017, if you look at Democrats, the line has been fairly straight. In fact, if you look at 2016, you would find that Democrats were exactly in the same position that they were in 1978. There's some jigs and jags up and down, but basically Democrats were exactly the same position they were in 1978, no change. Democrats as a whole, not necessarily activists, but Democrats as a whole. And then in the most recent year, you see a real decline among Democrats, really for the first time in a significant way. Why is that? Again, I would come back to the team nature of politics in part. An important part, and there are really two pieces to this. One was the Prime Minister's decision to come to Congress on Iran, which looked like to Democrats that the Prime Minister was choosing teams. He was siding with the Republicans, and if he's siding with the Republicans, then we Democrats are against him. That's just the way the politics works these days. We did a survey for USA Today a couple of years ago when this phenomenon was really just sort of heating up. And we gave people 2 education plans. I'm trying to give you something as neutral as possible here. 2 education plans. Forget the details, because the point is the details don't matter. We told half the sample that Plan A was the Democratic plan, Plan B was the Republican plan. We delineated the plans. We told the other half of the sample that Plan B was the Plan A was the Republican plan, and Plan B was the Democratic plan. Well, you can guess what the outcome was based on what I've said so far. The Democrats were for the Democratic plan, regardless of whether it had the content of Plan A or the content of Plan B, and Republicans were for what was labeled the Republican plan, regardless of the content. The substance made no difference whatever. It was all about the party label. So when the Prime Minister appears to be siding with the Republicans, Democrats are saying to themselves, well, obviously that means they're not on our side. Okay? That's part of American politics these days. Second, and related, you have a situation where over and over again you hear in the press that the 2 places in the world where Donald Trump, who is detested by Democrats in this country, the 2 places in the world where he is liked are Russia about whom Democrats used to have a very favorable opinion and now do not. And second, Israel, where Democrats used to have a very favorable opinion and less so today. Again, whose team are you on? If Israel's on Trump's team, he's not on Democrats' team. That's just the way this process tends to work. You'll also notice, at least before this year, almost all of the change had been among liberal Democrats. Among conservative and moderate Democrats, really no change at all. So it's a very concentrated group, or appears to be, in terms of liberal Democrats. But we can look at this data, we can say, oh, this is what's happening, but we have to be careful about drawing these conclusions, because Gallup has asked exactly the same question, okay, in Gallup polls over time, and they also asked it this year, and they do not find any change in Democrat support for Israel. So I just gave you data from Pew saying Democrats have become less sympathetic to Israel, and I gave you an explanation for why it is, but you'll look at Gallup and say, oh, actually it didn't happen at all. There's no change. Democrats in the Gallup data are as positive, as sympathetic to Israel today, and more sympathetic to Israel today than they were in 1988 and through most of the period of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So again, we don't even know for sure exactly what's going on here because the data is not abundantly clear. Now notice something else about this question. It asks people about their sympathy, who they sympathize with more, Israel or the Palestinians. Now, one way to understand that is, who do you support? But that's not the first definition that's in the Oxford English Dictionary. The first definition is feelings of sorrow and pity for someone else's misfortune. They had great sympathy, they had great sympathy for the flood victims. Well, if you were asked, if you were a liberal person, some of you may be, and were asked, who do you feel worse for? The Palestinians or the Israelis? Some of you might say, well, you know what, I feel I support Israel 100%, but I sort of feel worse for the Palestinians. They do have it worse off in some ways than the Israelis do. So maybe that's what you mean by sympathy here. So again, this data is a little bit cloudy. And we even see the clouds even more clearly when we ask people about who they want the United States to back. So before, we just saw most people in the country, sympathetic to Israel. When people are asked do they want the United States to take Israel's side or take the Palestinian side in the conflict, 6 out of 10 Americans say take nobody's side. Take neither side. Take neither side. 33% say take Israel's side. 4% say take the Palestinian side. A little bit different with Democrats, who are, a little bit different with Republicans, 57% of whom say take Israel's side, but 4 out of 10 Republicans are saying don't take anybody's side here. Democrats much more likely to say don't take anybody's side, almost 3/4, but independents rather more like the Democrats and the Republicans. But most Americans saying, I sympathize with Israel, but don't take their side, as the United States government, be even-handed, as we used to say, as they used to say. When we do the same kind of question with these progressive activists, they take the same kind of view. Again, 71% say we should support both equally, 18% say support the Palestinians a little bit more, 11% say support the Israelis a little bit more, but most people are saying the central tendency with these liberal activists is not to say let's support the Palestinians, say let's not support either side particularly, let's be even-handed. Views on a Palestinian state also vary very much just by the question wording. The panel on the left here is a survey that was asked by Harris poll in March of this year. Would you rather see one Israeli state with some areas supervised by Palestinians or 2 independent states, Israel and Palestine? 74% said 2 states. Okay? A month before, a slightly different question: do you support or oppose the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza? 45% in favor, 42% opposed. So these questions ought to be reflecting the same underlying value, the same underlying set of beliefs, but in fact you get very, very different answers depending on exactly the question that you ask. And the truth is, even when you ask the same question, which this is over time from Gallup, you get wildly different answers about a Palestinian state depending on the particular time you're asking the question. So again, a lot of instability in these kinds of numbers. Now, turning back to our progressive activists, they are very critical of both sides, but they certainly blame Israel a little bit more. And in focus groups we did with these progressive activists, we asked them to draw a picture of what the relationship looked like between Israel and the Palestinians, okay? They're not great artists. Nobody's going to pay $450 million for one of these drawings, but they do have a clear central tendency. A big, strong Israel with a weak little Palestine underfoot. Okay? That is the clear image that that most of these folks have. And in our focus groups, and I don't know how many of you are Spider-Man fans, but with great power comes great responsibility, says Spider-Man, right? So what these people say is, with greater power comes greater responsibility. So Israel, they say, is the more powerful actor. It's got a stronger army, it's got a stronger economy, it's got a stronger diplomatic support, it's stronger in every meaningful way. And as the stronger power, say these folks, Israel has the greater responsibility to observe human rights, to make concessions for peace, et cetera, et cetera. Then we can debate that notion, we can agree or disagree with it, but that is the perspective that these liberal activists, these progressive activists are bringing to the issue. If you're the actor with greater power, then you're the actor with greater responsibility. But still, among the 43% say the reason that there's not been a peace agreement is that Israel's been unwilling to stop the settlements and let Palestinians have a real sovereign state. One way to look at that is to say, well, that's what most of them think, and that's certainly true. The other way to look at that is to say 60% of people don't put their onus, 60% of liberal activists, people who are involved in the women's movement, the gay rights movement, in all kinds of environmental movement, all kinds of liberal activism, 60% of them don't see Israel as the primary party at fault. 27% say the Palestinians are the primary party at fault. And 30% admit that they really have no idea what they're talking about. Now, this is a question that we've asked among Israelis in Israel, and the results could not be more mere opposite. When we ask American progressive activists what they think the objective of the Palestinians is in this conflict, by 2 to 1, they say it is to come to a peace agreement with Israel that gives them as much as they can get, but leaves Israel intact. Only a third say that their goal is to destroy Israel and remove the Jewish people from the land. Now, if you ask this question in Israel, as I said, as we have, it is literally the mirror image. More than 2/3 of Israelis say the goal of the Palestinians is to drive Israel out of the land, and only a third of Israelis say that the Palestinians' goal is to have a state that's sort of as much as they can get, but live side by side with Israel. Very, very, very different perceptions here. But people are basically, again, these progressive activists, very much convinced that both sides are to blame for the lack of compromise. So again, we gave people sort of two arguments. The Palestinians are eager to negotiate and want to establish a peace agreement, but Israel is unwilling to make the necessary concessions. Or Israelis are eager to negotiate, establish a peace agreement. Palestinians are unwilling to make the necessary compromise, or they're both equally to blame. Overwhelmingly, these, again, progressive activists, 3/4 of them say, you know what, they're both equally to blame. Now, these progressive activists do understand some parts of the history. If you ask some people, like my sister who's an Israeli, she will say, look, the problem is that the non-Jews don't understand the linkage of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. I think that's not really true based on the evidence here. 76, but that's why we asked the question, because my sister says it. 76% say that, recognize that the Jewish people has a strong historical connection to the land of Israel. Only 24% say that there is no real connection. But they don't understand all the history. That's for sure, because over half of these progressive activists say there was once an independent country of Palestine that Israel invaded and took over. Okay? Again, not very well informed to be sure, and that is, it says something about our system of colleges, I guess, that the people who have a college degree are no more likely to have the real story than people who never went to college, at least on this particular set of facts. Americans. Progressive activists. That's the progressive activists, okay? Similarly, when these progressive activists are asked, like, what's the real important cause of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, overwhelmingly they say the primary cause is each religion believes the land is sacred and promised to them. A large number say no, it's because the Israelis refuse to recognize the right of Palestinians to have a state, and some say Israel's building settlements. Some say, about an equal number, say that Palestinians' refusal to recognize the right of Jewish people to have a state in the land of Israel is really the primary cause, sort of down from there. But the main point of blame is really the responsibility, I should say, is the sense that each religion believes the land is sacred. Let me just go through and then I promise we'll get to questions if I'm allowed. Nonetheless, all this said, again, we're talking to progressive activists, not talking to campus people, different story. We're talking to progressive activists, adult progressive activists. They don't know what BDS is, okay? Do you have a favorable, unfavorable view of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement? 71% say, I haven't the foggiest idea what you are talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. The people that do know about it tend to be more favorable than unfavorable, 21-8. Most people have no idea. And are they likely to participate? Well, no. If we gave people a scenario, okay, your product you want to buy, it's the right price, it's the right product. You find out it's from Israel, are you more likely to buy it, less likely to buy it, based on the fact that it comes from Israel? 2/3 say it doesn't make a whit's worth of difference to me, and a few more people say I'm more likely to buy it than less likely to buy it. So, in fact, they are anti-BDS, if they're anything, but the truth is for most of them it doesn't make any difference at all. Just following on something Jacob said a moment ago, human rights very much now judged a priority in forging alliances by progressive activists. We ask people in a very broad way, what characteristics would you like to see in American allies? By far, the number one, almost consensus, 95%, either the first or second choice was a country that respects human rights. So remember, people are saying Israel respects the human rights of Jews, does not respect the human rights of Palestinians, and that is the single most important thing to almost all of these people in terms of what they're looking for in an ally. Okay, my John Lennon test. Anybody know the song Imagine? Yes. You feel comfortable with that song? You express it something positive for you? Okay, so yes, very good. What does that song say? Okay, it's about universalism. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, no religion too. Now if you sort of take all of that literally, where does that leave the Zionist movement? Okay, not, no religion, no countries, this is not really a world in which we can be very comfortable as Zionists. But that is the world in which a lot of people on the left tend to inhabit. And a lot of people think they inhabit that world even if they're not on the left. So again, just one of the changes that's taken place over time. So just some conclusions that we draw from this. This is not a zero-sum game. To dislike the Palestinians or the PA is not necessarily to be sympathetic to Israel. These progressive activists see Israel as a religious Jewish state driven by a thirst for land as well as by security needs to oppose a Palestinian state and to build provocative settlements. They recognize Jews' connection to the land, but do believe Palestinians also have a just claim which Israel won't recognize. Many believe there was an independent state of Palestine which Israel invaded. So given this ignorance, communication, simplify, not inform, not get bogged down or assume knowledge. Again, with greater power comes greater responsibility. So in their view, the onus is clearly on Israel as the more powerful party. Most lean towards being more sympathetic to the Palestinians, who are seen as weaker and the underdog. But these progressives are really not anti-Israel haters. They believe Israel has a right to exist. They don't want to see the state disappear into the sea. And perhaps most importantly, they don't believe that their activities, they do not believe that their activities, whether BDS or anything else, is contributing in any way, shape, or form to the disappearance of Israel. Now, we can obviously disagree with that, but they see this in a very, very different way. See BDS, they see the other sort of, we would consider anti-Israel activity in a very different light than we do. Facts and information need to appear to be balanced. One-sided pro-Israel messages are just regarded as propaganda. Admissions of imperfection do add credibility. Progressives do see Israel as culturally closer to the U.S., and we can point this out, but we need to be careful not to imply that Palestinians, by contrast, are barbaric. Because progressives are particularly sensitive to us versus them characterizations, and they'll react very strongly against any messages that appear to imply something negative about a group of people as a group. So again, understand this lefty audience. They divide the world between oppressed and oppressors, and they are acutely attuned to suffering. That is one of the differences between liberals and conservatives. Liberals are much more attuned to suffering. And so when they see suffering, whether it's I'll feel, but if baby seals or Palestinians, doesn't matter. When they see that suffering, liberals tend to be much more attuned to that. They mostly believe in Israel's right to exist, again, don't see their activities as a threat to that. They see BDS as a nonviolent movement called into existence by the Palestinians. They think what they are doing is enhancing human rights and making some small progress towards ending the occupation. They hold Israel to a higher standard, in part because Israel claims to be like us. We say, well, it's worse in Saudi Arabia. So of course it's worse in Saudi Arabia. They're Saudis. They don't claim to be like us. Israel claims to be like us. If Israel's going to claim to be like us, then they need to behave like us. Now, we would argue, well, of course, Israel does behave like us. We don't behave perfectly all the time either. And these people would say, no, America, as much as critical as they are of America, they believe behaves better than Israel does. Again, greater power, greater responsibility. So let me just talk a little bit in closing about messages that tend to work. The best message tax that we have tend to focus on the constant threats facing Israel. Israel is strong, should admit that, but it faces real threats. Iran trying to build nuclear weapons, says they're committed to destroying Israel. Terrorist groups in the countries surrounding Israel hold around 75,000 rockets and missiles that can reach major cities. Many Israeli children sleep in bomb shelters. Terrorist attacks against pizza parlors, buses, and pedestrians make people fearful to leave home. All this takes a real toll. So there's a real threat. People do believe that. Highlighting that threat matters. Highlighting the difficult choices that Israel faces and putting that in the form of a question, not in the form of dogmatism. Hamas has placed missile sites in schools and hospitals, which creates a moral dilemma. Okay? It's a real problem. It's a real question. It's not all or nothing. It's a real question. Does the terrorist group get a pass if it does that? Question. Many Israeli soldiers have aborted strikes when they see civilians, but sometimes the civilians go unseen or the threat is just too great. But again, when you couch it as a moral dilemma, people are saying, oh, I understand it's a complex situation. Israel's similarity to the US and difference from the region. In a region where women are stoned, gays are hanged, Christians are persecuted, Israel stands out. It is different. It's much more like us. Not totally like us. It's just much more like us. Both vibrant democracies that respect the rule of law, women's rights, LGBT rights, and human rights overall. And then there's Israel's technological and humanitarian contributions. Israel has one of the most innovative economies in the world. Paraplegic American veterans will soon be able to walk as a result of the Israeli bionic assistance system. Israeli internet security makes e-commerce possible. Pill cams make colonoscopies and other procedures easier, God willing, soon I hope. The most effective drug for Parkinson's developed by Israelis. Israel also developed the first flash drive for computers, leader in clean fuel technology and irrigation systems that are growing food in Africa, other drought-stricken regions. When disaster strikes, whether in the floods in the Philippines, hurricanes in Haiti, tsunamis in Thailand, Israeli medical teams with advanced equipment to find and heal survivors are often among the first on the scene. So there are some messages that work with these lefty audiences. We do have, appears, some problem with these lefty audiences, but it's important to understand where they're coming from. So let me take the last question first, and the answer is the question changed. In the 70s, that is, before that it was Arabs, not Palestinians. So that's why we sort of started with that point in the time series. That's also when Pew started doing polls. So that's just a factual thing. If you look back at the Israel versus Arabs, you will see in most of that period very little difference between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, the second question was sort of on generational versus age effects, and the shorter answer is we don't know. I mean, I'd love to know. We don't know this about a whole lot of things in the world, whether generational effects or age effects are really what we're seeing, and we certainly don't know it here because we have not had the data to observe same people over time and see what happens, how their opinions evolve. So I could make a guess, but it would be worthless. Balance. So what I mean by balance is some kind of admission of imperfection. So when you say, one way to say, take the Hamas example that I use, one way to say this is to say, they're putting missile sites in schools and hospitals. We have to take out those missile sites. Israel has to take out those missile sites. That's just what we have to do, okay? That's an unbalanced way of saying it. A slightly more balanced way is to say, hey, they do this and it creates a moral dilemma. It's a problem. And Israel tries its best to respect the hospitals and the schools and the whatnot, but sometimes it doesn't work out for various good reasons. So again, it's just a sense of balance. If you do again, I'm talking here about the progressive left, but if you say the first to the progressive left, they'll say no. If you say the second to the progressive left, they're going to say, yes, that makes sense. So it's a question of having some kind of giving something to the view that that Israel is not perfect, that not everything it does is 100% justified. If you start from that perspective, you will get an argument, and I would say you get the same argument from those people when Palestinians do that. I've done a number of the AIPAC trips with political people to Israel, and one of the things that they do after Yad Vashem is take them to see a representative of the Palestinians, and inevitably, first of all, it's after Yad Vashem, so it's rigged, as Bernie Sanders might say, but on purpose. But with the other thing that happens is those Palestinians come in and it's like 100% Israel is totally evil. Everything they're doing is terrible. And they control the New York Times, by the way, anyway. And people say, wait a second, this is crazy talk. Nobody's always right. Nobody's right about everything. We see that there's complexity here. They're not recognizing the complexity. So the same thing works on both sides. We have to be a little bit more subtle sometimes too. Thank you very much.